Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into one of the most fascinating and honestly highest stakes aerospace engineering stories happening right now. We're talking about the massive effort to literally put a cutting-edge artificial intelligence brain inside a true Cold War relic. The stakes here absolutely couldn't be higher. We're bridging mid-20th century iron with 21st century silicon. It's a story of incredible ambition, but as we recently learned, it's also a story of immense, devastating risk. 70. Just let that sink in for a second. The B-52 airframe, the iconic Stratofortress, has been flying for over 70 years. It first took to the skies back in the 1950s. It's the absolute granddaddy of military aviation, and it's outlasted literal generations of pilots. It's just been constantly adapting, constantly upgrading, and somehow surviving constantly changing global threats. Okay, let's dive into this. Why exactly is the United States Air Force trying to retrofit a 70-year-old heavy bomber with an AI brain and a fighter-grade radar? What's the logic there? Well, the answer reveals a massive, multi-billion-dollar bet the military is making on the future. But as we recently saw, that bet has hit a really tragic and devastating roadblock. So, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, the Edwards Air Force Base crash. Then, the anatomy of the Stratofortress, followed by a history of tragedies, the 1994 Fairchild incident, the $48 billion upgrade, and finally, the future of the fleet.
All right, Section 1, the Edwards AFB crash.
We really have to start with the urgent, breaking news that just fundamentally shifted the timeline of this whole modernization program. So on the morning of June 15, 2026, out at Edwards Air Force Base in the California Mojave Desert, a B-52H, specifically tail number 0061, crashed shortly after takeoff. Tragically, 8 crew members and test personnel lost their lives. And it's really critical to understand here. This wasn't a combat loss in a war zone. This was a devastating anomaly right on departure. Strategically speaking, losing tail number 0061 is a massive blow because it was the absolute leading edge of the entire fleet. It was literally the sole test bed for that new AI brain and the AESA radar. There was no backup aircraft sitting in a hangar ready to take its place.
To truly grasp how something like this happens, you kind of have to look at the nature of experimental aviation. A former NTSB investigator perfectly summed this up on PBS, saying, "A flight test is always riskier than normal operations. That's why you have specially trained test pilots and additional safety protocols." This wasn't just some routine ferry flight from point A to point B. They were pushing the absolute flight envelopes, testing the extreme edge cases of integrating a highly advanced 21st century radar system into a plane that was originally designed with, slight rules. The inherent risk was just immense.
Let's move to Section 2 and see how this builds. Anatomy of the Stratofortress. To really understand why a takeoff anomaly is so completely unforgiving in this specific aircraft, we have to look at its mechanical DNA, 488,000. That is the amount of weight, in pounds, that the flight controls of this aircraft must physically muscle off a runway during a heavy departure. It is a flying behemoth. It's basically a massive truck of the sky. And managing all that weight? Well, that relies entirely on something called the SAS, or Stability Augmentation System. Now, this flight system puts complete 100% reliance on hydraulic control power for both the rudder and the elevators. Even the horizontal stabilizer, which handles the rotation authority on takeoff, is hydraulically adjustable. So think about this. If there is a hydraulic anomaly, or some avionics event that corrupts the flight control bus when you're low, slow, and totally committed on departure, the crew is left with almost zero window for recovery. It's incredibly tight margins.
Now, what's really fascinating about this and kind of wild is that the B-52 doesn't even have ailerons. The most iconic bomber in history actually rolls using hydraulically actuated spoilers. Basically, these are panels on the wing surface that pop up to disrupt lift asymmetrically, and that's how it banks. It is some crazy engineering. But ultimately, this machine was engineered primarily for high-altitude crews, carrying massive payloads over huge distances. It was just never truly designed for the razor-thin margins of complicated low and slow departure emergencies.
Which brings us to Section 3, a history of tragedies. Sadly, the B-52's incredibly long service life has been punctuated by some pretty severe accidents, and a lot of them stem directly from the aging airframe's vulnerabilities in high-stress situations. Let's look back at the Cold War era. In 1961, over Goldsboro, North Carolina, a B-52 broke apart in midair just from wind fatigue, dropping 2 nuclear bombs that thankfully didn't detonate. Just months later, in Yuba City, California, decompression and fuel starvation caused another crash. Then, in 1966, over Palomares, Spain, a fatal mid-air collision with a refueling tanker actually scattered radioactive material. And in 1968, a cabin heater fire led to a catastrophic crash right on the ice in Thule, Greenland. Walking through this staggering volume of Broken Arrow nuclear incidents really gives you a picture of just how chaotic and dangerous the operating environment was for this airframe during those early decades.
Moving on to Section 4, the 1994 Fairchild Incident.
So, while mechanical fatigue is definitely a historical enemy of the B-52, we also have to talk about the profound risk of human error. Back in 1994, at Fairchild Air Force Base, a B-52 crashed during an airshow practice. But that disaster was driven by reckless pilot bravado. You had a pilot trying to fly a heavy bomber like it was a nimble little fighter jet, just yanking and banking, eventually overbanking past 90 degrees until the aircraft completely lost its lift. That scenario is entirely different from what happened at Edwards in 2026. The 2026 crash was a highly calculated test flight, flown by highly trained test personnel, dealing with what is strongly suspected to be an unavoidable mechanical or hydraulic anomaly. Basically, one was a complete failure of safety culture, while the other shows the inherent, unavoidable danger of pushing experimental aviation right to its limits.
Let's get into Section 5, the $48 billion upgrade. So, the crucial point here is, why even take these risks at all? I mean, why not just retire the B-52 entirely? Well, it's because the Air Force isn't just maintaining these old planes, they are radically transforming them. The 8 original Pratt & Whitney TF-33 engines, they're being completely ripped out and replaced by modern Rolls-Royce F-130s. The clunky old analog radars are being swapped for the ANA/APQ-188 AESA radar. That is the exact same advanced technology that powers modern fighter jets, and it gives this massive bomber unprecedented mapping and targeting capabilities. This upgrade is so absolutely comprehensive that it literally changes the aircraft's official designation from the B-52H to the B-52J. And this brilliantly illustrates the long-term strategic vision, which is just staggering. The Air Force plans to keep flying the B-52J well into the 2050s. Just think about that for a second. 100-year lifespan. It's going to operate as a standoff arsenal bomber. Essentially, it'll act as a massive, high-tech flying truck that hangs back and launches long-range cruise missiles, while the next-generation, ultra-stealthy B-21 Raider penetrates deep into hostile airspace. They're designed to be a perfectly matched pair, one for absolute stealth and one for sheer, overwhelming firepower. Finally, Section 6, Future of the Fleet, which really brings our narrative full circle. What does the tragic loss of the 6061 testbed mean for the U.S. Air Force right now? Well, the immediate impact of the crash is a massive logistical hurdle. Like we mentioned, there is currently no second testbed built for that AI brain and radar integration. Because of that, the data gathering they need to make production decisions for the entire 76-plane fleet is likely going to be delayed by about 6 months. However, the modernization is not stopping. The massive $15 billion bomber engine replacement program has actually passed its critical design review and continues completely unaffected. Ground and flight testing for those new engines is still scheduled for later in 2026. The Air Force is absolutely pressing forward. Which leaves us with this final, truly provocative thought to wrap up today. As we mourn the loss of the crew at Edwards, and as we watch the military pour nearly $49 billion into a Cold War relic, can new technology truly future-proof a 70-year-old machine? Or are there fundamental physical limits to aerospace engineering that no amount of AI and silicon can ever truly overwrite? It's a massive question, and it's one that will define the next 3 decades of global air power. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking the big questions, and I'll catch you on the next one.